Hey, folks. Sorry we're about a minute late. We're having a little bit of technical issues. Malik is still trying to log in because their internet is being stupid. For the time being, it's just going to be me until Malik shows up. So the theme for this particular episode is going to be going beyond step one. Since we spent a lot of our last broadcast talking about like what the basics are, spiritual hygiene, and things like that, we're going to kind of carry that theme forward. And because of my recent health issues, I am not going to be drinking tonight. Tonight is going to be a stone cold sober night for me. I am going to have coffee, but not just any normal coffee. It's coffee brewed with 9 heaping spoonfuls of coffee. So this is basically Odinson mud. Hey, Emily. Good to see you. Hey, Destiny. Good to see you too. I'm really looking forward to this episode, especially because this is something that, when you get years in and you don't talk about the basics as much, sometimes you can really lose focus on how to talk about this stuff because it becomes such second nature. So that's part of why I was really looking forward to this particular kind of mini series of topics for our show. Because like sometimes you get to this point of, I've put so many years in. Hey, Malik, good to see you.
Hold on, I cannot hear anything. There we go. Well, I can.
There you go. So like I was saying, you get to this point of you've put so many years in, your practice is just your practice, that you sometimes either forget that not everybody operates at the level you're used to, or you're so used to talking with jargon that communicating this shit gets hard. So glad you could come on and glad your internet decided to stop hiccuping.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, well, it's not... We're going to see how stable it is. If it throws a fit and kicks me off or I go full robot or something, I'll switch to my phone. It's been throwing a fit lately here where like it just is and we can't figure out why. I think we're going to end up switching modems and routers to a different one because I think that's most likely the issue. 100%. One, have we done the prayer yet?
We have not, and you know what? You may as well switch to the phone because you are really desynced.
Okay, I will do that and I will be back.
All right, see you in just a minute. I will hold off on the prayer and I will just chat until you come back. So those of you beautiful people who are joining us, please put in the chat what kinds of things you would like to have us explore beyond step one. Because, this is a show that we do for our own pleasure, but we also want to see what you want us to cover. So if you have ideas for like what beyond step one, beyond the basics of what's my spiritual outlook and what does the basics of spiritual hygiene look like, if you want to have us explore something like that, by all means, put it in the chat here and or put it in the Discord. Pardon me. So when I think of beyond step one, sometimes there's a little bit of difficulty because like you gotta kind of find what direction you want to wander in. So
hey,
there you go.
Is that better?
A little bit of feedback. I can hear myself on your end.
Good. Let me make sure that I can actually hear and see and everything. Apologies for being on my phone. That's kind of a nightmare, but
Do you have earbuds or something? Because I can hear myself in feedback.
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Yep. So I'm going to keep chatting because Malik's on mute. One of the difficulties is once you're beyond the basics of this is the basics of my polytheist and animist worldview, where do you go from there? Because it's almost like you've got such choice. There can be sometimes a kind of a choice paralysis unless you're very certain on where you want to look. And so to a certain degree, like getting beyond the basic steps of what does discernment like? What does the basics of your pathway look like? What's your religious outlook? Once you get past step one, you get this entire world that opens up for you. And that's where people can sometimes get kind of lost in the weeds. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes getting lost in the weeds means that you get to Go wherever your little heart desires in terms of exploration. And I think that's one of the greatest things about polytheism and animism is that there's such a variety of topics you could explore or go into and intersections all over the place. Like back when I was in college, one of the things that really informed a lot of my study early on, besides being a former Catholic, hey, Finn, good to see you. Hey, you guys, who the fuck has made it for the first time in ages? Good to see you, Finn. One of the things that informed a lot of my early exploration was my burgeoning interest in psychology. And so one of the modalities that I really still like quite a lot are transpersonal psychology and ecopsych. Ecopsychology is great, especially because it intentionally looks at matters of mind and heart with regards to the environment you live in. So this can be things like environmental racism, like say you're from a black family that's lived next to, say, a lead production facility, and it's the only place that would rent to you. That is actually taken into consideration with ecopsych and with environment as one of the chief factors to look at for the medical model. And so when it comes to exploring different ideas, it's almost so large once you get past the basics that it can be really intimidating and hard to get through unless you're absolutely sure of where you want to go or you're being pushed in a direction and you're following where it leads.
All right. How's my audio now?
Much, much better. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Apologies about all that, folks. I have been listening more or less on what Sarenth is saying and have generally agreed with everything. So
it's cool. You just sound like, you should be speaking with a transatlantic accent. Hi, everybody. Jolly good. You've
well,
got that
hi.
kind of, you got that like that radio feel to your audio right now. It's kind of fun.
The very vague tinniness to it. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So did you want me to go ahead with the prayer, or do you want to make it tonight?
If you don't mind tackling it, just because I'm a little discombobulated.
All good. I got you.
I appreciate it.
All right. So, hail sons and daughters of Muspelheim, hail fire itself. Hail. Mikal Eldevator, hail Eldevator, hail Galakahai, hail Suna, hail Loki, hail Blut, hail Logi, hail Sert, hail Senmora. Hail. Mikal Eldevator, hail Eldevator. Estu hail. Hail to those who show us the ways. Hail to those who teach. Hail to those who learn. And hail to those who work. Hail to those who bring us to the next step. Hail to those who help us reaffirm where we are. Gods, ancestors, and Vatir, holy ones all, named and unnamed, those who influence our path, our past, our present, and our future, those who have laid the groundwork and those who will work with us, those who are in community with us and those who are outside of our communities who yet influence us. Hail to all of you and thank you for your blessings, thank you for your work, and thank you for your companionship. Hail to you all. Bestu hail.
Hey, everyone, and welcome to our radio show.
Good stuff.
I'm just going to be channeling Alistair from...
Hazbin Hotel? Or,
yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's Hazbin Hotel. I get Hazbin Hotel and Hell of a Boss mixed up because they're the same universe.
So good.
They're fantastic. Highly recommend for some good blasphemous TV. One thing you were saying before I had to hop off was getting so used to working in things that you forget you use jargon and you forget that not everyone knows what the hell is going on. I had that happen in real time, and I think it's important to remember that a lot of this is very domain specific. It's not like, oh, if you know about spirit work, that means you know about all spirit work. Very much not the case. Someone who might know a whole lot about as a random example, someone who is a really intense firekeeper and has a ton of experience tending sacred fires and all of this stuff may have literally no knowledge or experience about possessory work, and may have never seen it and have basically no knowledge of it. Um, I was working with I was ground crew for someone's not first, but one of their first intense possessory. They're beginning possessory work, um, and I was ground crew for one of their first experiences with that recently. And afterwards, because they're an experienced spirit worker, I know they know what they're doing. I trust them very, very highly. Uh, I just went into ground crew mode and started doing a bunch of stuff that for me, who has done that before, is like, yeah, this is normal. This is what you do. You ground out really heavily. You do a bunch of cleansing where you do blah, 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 blah. And they were like, what the hell are you doing? I need you to explain to me step by step what you are doing and why, because I don't know what you're doing. And it is not freaking me out, but almost there. Like, what the hell? Because and that's another thing, is like we hadn't talked about it completely beforehand, because I had assumed a bunch of knowledge on their part that they didn't have, uh, which is my fault for not communicating more clearly, and not their fault at all because they didn't know. So yeah. Um, and this is a person who has literally decades of spirit work under their belt. Like,
Right. You can't assume that everybody's going to be on the same page. That way lies foolishness. But also, sometimes assuming somebody doesn't have the knowledge can be offensive. So
yes.
it's best to check instead of assuming anything, because you might have somebody who's done decades and decades and decades of talking with spirits, but has no practical knowledge on how to remove an entity because they've never had to. Because maybe they've been just so goddamn lucky this whole time that they've never had to remove anything ever.
Yeah.
I've run across it before. It doesn't happen very often, but occasionally you'll hit somebody who's just like, it's not even Pollyannish. It's just they've gotten either so goddamn lucky or they're just so protected that they've never had to deal with this shit.
Yeah. Or, it might even be like, oh, they ran across it, but they didn't know what the issue was in particular. They weren't the one who was set to deal with it. Like, if your client is coming to, in a professional spirit worker sense, right? If you've got a client coming to you and you're doing a reading for them and they happen to have a really nasty spirit attachment, but that's not what they're there for,
Right.
you might not, right? Like, it might not come up. So
this is why spiritual specialists are different from one another. Ooh, there's also, this is a really good point. There's also tradition-specific knowledge and procedures and vocab, like a Hellenist versus a Buddhisant. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I would not presume to speak on fuck all anything with regards to voodoo. And even though I have some connections with Hellenic deities, that's a very certain cross-section.
Yeah. And like, this is why I go to pretty great lengths. Sarenth and I both do this. I go to pretty great lengths to not just define the words that I'm using, but like talk around them for a while, because I don't, like, dictionary definitions aren't great. And because having a similar vocabulary for what we're talking about is very important, and not all words are used the same everywhere, right? If you go to multiple different um, groups, patron deity might mean different things and have wildly different contexts, right? In some groups, everyone has a patron deity. In some groups, only a few people have a patron deity. In other groups, and what the patron deity means and does might be very different things. In some groups, a patron deity is like they're the patron of like a profession, kind of like Athena is the patron deity of Athens.
Yeah. When you're talking about, if you don't mind,
Yeah, please.
like one of the things that I thought was brought to mind when I was doing my Hinduism 101 course back in college, they would talk very frequently about bhakti worship and how it was like you were focused on a god. And in modern pagan parlance, we might call them a patron god, but that's just the bhakti worshiper is just this is the object of their devotion, and they
Yeah.
would. There's a lot of connotation with having a patron that isn't there with other religious pathways. So we got to
Yeah.
also be really careful that we're not relativizing and flattening differences.
And even like you said, there are connotations to a patron deity, but that also depends on context, right? In some uses of the word patron deity, it's the god you pray to because they're in charge of your profession, right? Like
Right.
a craftsperson, a Hellenic craftsperson praying to Hephaestus as a patron deity because that's who's in charge of their profession. Versus like in some contexts, Sarenth, I believe you've described Odin as your patron deity,
Mhm.
which makes sense. Why? Because he's in charge of what you fucking do. Like,
Right.
and these are wildly different contexts, right? One
I
hand is
wouldn't-
very
And I wouldn't use the term matron deity for Freya because of the
Mm-hmm.
implications of the term matron.
um,
Like, honestly, like if I had multiple patron deities, it would be Othin and Freya at this point. And it's not to say that this is where language becomes kind of clunky, because it's not to say that Frigga doesn't matter or that she is not highly honored. It's that these two particular gods have a very prominent place in my life and my practice.
Yeah.
And modern heathenry has a term called fultrui, but I don't use that when it's regarding gods that you're working for. Now, I might consider Odin a fultrui, which is a fully trusted one. But in the saga sources, they're talking more about a god that they basically look at as the dearest friend you can have.
yeah.
And I don't really have that with Odin because more often than not, he's my taskmaster. I trust Odin to be Odin and I love him as a father and all that other stuff. But I don't call him fultrui because there's an implication there. I don't have that relationship with Othin.
Yeah, for sure. And I think fultrui is interesting again because it's used different ways by different people.
Right.
I would personally, most of the context that I have seen it used in, I would say it is most closely akin to a god-spouse relationship as I understand them, but without a romantic or sexual component.
Right.
Which, in my understanding, most god-spouse relationships have at least one of those, if not both.
Mm-hmm.
Though obviously not everyone's relationships will be different and all of that. It is. I'm just going to say this upfront. If I'm taking a long time talking, it's because the experience of listening to myself speak with headphones in is actually distracting. I know it's necessary for audio to work, but like I'm so not used to doing it during broadcasts that I'm like, I can hear the echo of my own voice in my head in a way I don't normally do, and it's very interesting.
I think it's also the other thing with a lot of the verbiage, because when you start talking about beyond step one of having the basics of your worldview, the basics of your path, and the kinds of things that you want to explore, when you're talking about beyond step one, like discernment and path, you're talking about like, what are my actual interests at this point?
Mm-hmm.
So like, and that can like be wide ranging, and one interest of magic may have nothing to do with the particular religious path you're on.
Very true.
It might have like some intersection, but it's not obviously connected with the religious path. Like there's folks in the community who, for instance, I think of my co-host Snow in this regard, like around Grandfather Fire, they explore a lot of occult streams of knowledge and information that aren't directly relevant to heathenry itself, but they are still heathen. But they do incorporate it into their overall milieu. And they're still definitely heathen, and they're still definitely practicing occultism. And it's not like neither the twain shall meet, but there's extra work you've got to do to make these things fit well together.
Yes,
And,
very
like,
much agreed.
my hat is completely off to Snow on this regard because that's a lot of fucking work.
It is. And along with interests, I would also say, uh, also natural talents and things. Like
Yeah.
you might have, um, like someone who is a really powerful natural ground might get called in to be ground crew a lot and not really have a lot of interest in it, and they just do it because, well, I'm good at it and people need it, so I do it. But really what I dig is doing all of the sigil work that I do on the side. That's my like passion project. That's the thing that I want to do, and I do the groundwork because people need it. And that may be more or less begrudging depending on the person and the context, but like interest and skill set aren't always aligned. It's nice when they are, and they tend to be because the more practice you put into something, the better you're going to be at it, right?
Right.
But they're not necessarily the same thing, and I think that's an important distinction because I don't want anyone watching the show to ever feel like, oh, well, you have to be good at things in order to
No,
do them.
no.
Like, absolutely the fuck
You are
not.
going to
That's
suck when you start with new things.
absolutely.
Generally
And if you
speaking.
yeah, like if you happen to be a natural prodigy at whatever you're doing, great, good for you. Pursue that as long as it interests you or you need to. But like, don't expect that all the time. Like,
No.
yeah.
There's something also like with regards to, and I'm going to pick on Snow a little bit more here because like one of the things of translating between the different verbiages we use, even though we are in
Mhm.
the same community,
Mhm.
that's a process because I understand jack and shit about astrology.
Mhm.
And it's not for lack of trying. The math throws me and the concepts are confusing to me. I've tried several times to study astrology. It's just, I'm a brick when it comes to this. And at this point, I'm old enough to go, you know what? I don't really have to be good at everything.
It's really fascinating to me. I have been told very explicitly, like I was doing work like exploratory work in pack stuff, in pack tradition stuff, and uh I was very explicitly told and had it confirmed by Dave that like astrology is somebody else's fucking job. You got dirt things to do. Quit worrying about the stars. That is someone else's problem.
Right.
Um, which is very funny because then I immediately got into a bunch of classes where they're like, astrology is important, and I'm like,
Neat.
that's fine, neat. I will just. Oh, you have a book where I can just line things up. Perfect. That's all I need. Yep, cool. All the better.
It's actually one of the guests that we had on our show. It's part of why it was Polyphonies, I believe, Sam Block, who actually developed a
Mhm.
ritual book for a year where it outlines all the astrological information you could ever want to know.
Yeah. And they're working primarily in Western astrology, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Which it's also worth noting for people who are not familiar with this. There are multiple astrology systems, and they don't all line up.
No, at all.
You know, what we call like or what I just called Western astrology is more like Greek and Mediterranean astrology. There is also Vedic and Hindu astrology, and then there's also Eastern astrology, where you've got like Tibetan, Chinese, and Mongolian astrology that are all very similar but not exactly the same. Uh, and those are just ones that I personally am vaguely familiar with
Right.
off the top of my head. Like I know that there are more systems out there. I just don't know them.
Really quick, I want to point out this from Finn. It's similar with me blending Norse and Gaelic, not near as difficult, but the same concept. I would argue in some ways it's actually harder because I can plug in magical stuff into a heathen context and make that work a little better. Because when somebody's like, how do you translate the Awen into heathenry? And I'm like, I don't, because the Awen's its own concept.
Yeah.
If I had to translate it into something, it most closely comes to Other for me, which is inspiration or frenzy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not really the same.
Yeah, it's not exactly the same. And you and I have had this conversation several times about pack tradition stuff.
Right.
And like how that's actually where because originally the system was, as I had kind of started developing it, I was calling it pack magic, and that
Right.
word threw you for such a loop because that came with all kinds of context for you that were not true. Like they were true originally in the original conception, but very quickly became apparent that like these aren't accurate and you need to change how you're approaching things. You here being me, not Sarenth or the viewer. You here being me. It very quickly became apparent that my understanding of what was going on was deeply flawed and needed to change.
I actually
And
want to
so,
pick on that a little bit because that's a
yeah,
really important point of getting beyond step one. Because once you've got some of the basic concepts down, and I mean down as in you understand them, you can actually use them in context. That's when you can get into some of this area where you're like, wow, my understanding was this narrow. And now as I've grown, I can recognize that the box has shifted. And maybe it's not a box anymore. Maybe it's a ball.
a ball or a bag or what have you, right? Like,
Right.
and we saw this freaking in live time a couple months ago where I had been
Yeah.
doing pack specific divination for years. And I had the system down. I knew how it worked and all of this. And it was really, I found it to be very effective and very accurate and all this stuff. And then I commissioned a casting cloth from another tradition member, and it was made correctly and in a good way. And there was months and months of work that went into it. And I got it, and it was like, oh, I knew nothing. This is what the hell. It was wild the change that just, oh yeah, you were playing with the kids set. Here's how adults do things, and I was like, what? um I can understand what you're saying. I guess I have blended them long enough, I guess, that it has become second nature. That's yeah, and that's the thing that happens too, right? Is you once you start blending things, once you start working generally, like we were saying, like Sarenth was saying, um, you get to a spot where you forget what things are hard. Uh, I call this the professor problem, where like you know so much that you forget what other people don't know. You forget what is actually advanced knowledge because, oh yeah, like I'm a physics professor. I've been doing complicated multivariable calculus, for 30 or 40 years. Uh, I can do that shit in my sleep. I can program a computer to do it. I can program a computer to do math problems that literally we do not have enough time to physically do since computers have invented by hand. And it does it in seconds because I've been doing that for, a decade. Yeah, okay, that's all really complicated stuff for someone who doesn't know what you're talking about.
Right. If you've never stepped into a physics classroom in your life and some jackass is putting something on the board and it looks, well, actually, some of it is Greek.
A large part of it is actually Greek. Like,
or in my case, like when I start trotting out the old Norse terms and I get the deer in the headlights look when I'm doing a workshop, it's like, don't worry, I have the glossary for this.
yeah. Well, no, and that's why I try to, and forget sometimes, but often be like, Sarenth, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, I know what you're talking about, but you're using a bunch of very specific jargon that not everyone knows.
Yeah. When I do workshops, this is very frequently why I front load with definitions. Because God, this is well over 15 years ago. I used to do workshops and people would give me this deer in the headlights and the Q&A comment section to be taken up with people asking for basic definitions. And I'd realize, oh, some of these people aren't following along whatsoever.
Yeah.
And that's not really like a me problem. It's not really a them problem. It's just like you haven't communicated effectively enough.
Yeah, it's a context problem. They do not have the context for what you are talking about. Part of that context is, what do the words you are using mean? that
Right.
really hinders communication, it turns out.
Well, yeah, like beyond step one, when I say this is what magic is,
Mhm.
by the time you hit beyond step one and you're a pagan or a heathen or a aura, you should have an idea of what the fuck magic means to you. And you should also have an idea of what it means to the community writ large.
Very true. It's actually, speaking of definitions, it's probably worthwhile for us to go and say, like, what do we mean when we say beyond step one?
Right. So what do you mean?
So, for reference, go back and, if you haven't already, watch the last episode 62, because we're on 63. Yes, 62, which was basics and foundations, right? What I am talking about beyond step one is anything beyond grounding and centering, which I include meditation in that, cleansing, shielding, and basic devotional work, which is, for me, just making offerings and keeping an altar space. And I am referring very specifically to people who are animist and polytheists in something that would be recognizable to modern neo-pagans. Which is that's a lot of definition, but I do think it's important for context. Because, like, someone who is, by modern neo-pagan definitions, an animist and polytheist might be working in, like, Vodou, and they consider themselves a Catholic, right? And they consider themselves a monotheist. Yeah, okay, we mean different things with the words we're saying, but we can still talk to each other. Also, with the caveat of, if your tradition says something different than what I am saying, listen to your fucking elders, not me. Because, like, Vodou, for example, making offerings, at least to some of the spirits, is an initiated only thing, and do not fucking do that if you do not know how, because you will get dead.
Right. If you have any questions, talk to a fully initiated Hungan, Mampo, or other initiated person in the tradition in question. Please, and thank you.
Please, dear
appropriation
gods.
is bad, not only because appropriation is terrible on its face, but it's also bad for your health.
It is actively bad for your health. Go talk to a priest. Like, it's really kind of that simple. Like, don't take from ATRs or ADRs, because
don't take from fucking anything you don't have a right to, really. Like, if you believe the spirits are real, they'll fucking eat your feet.
Yeah, no, and that's just it.
Let me correct myself. It doesn't matter if you believe they're real or not. The spirits are real, and they will eat your goddamn feet.
And also, it's just really fucking rude. Like,
Right.
Don't do that. It's rude and harmful to take people's stuff without, like, understanding context and with their permission. Like,
I will say this for open traditions as well.
Mm-hmm.
If something looks shiny, it doesn't mean you have to pick it up. And if what you're talking about is trance work and you're not talking about Sather, don't use the fucking word out of context.
Yeah.
Please. Because it makes it so much harder for the rest of us to figure out what the fuck you're talking about.
Exactly. So when I say beyond step one, that's what I'm calling step one, right? Is open tradition, devotional work, and then basic spiritual hygiene. And these are kind of all wrapped up together, right? Because if you are not spiritually clean enough, and that degree varies depending on personal
enough is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah, a lot of heavy lifting there. But if you're not spiritually clean enough, walking, like, touching things in your altar space can be wildly inappropriate, and can actually, like, invite repercussions, right? You could up to and including deconsecrating sacred objects, with everything that implies. Like, that's not to say, like, I also have an issue where I have a kind of I focus over much, to the point that my spirits have yelled at me about it, on being spiritually clean when I don't need to be.
Right.
right? Like it does. There is
There's a difference between being spiritually clean and spiritually debriding yourself.
exactly, and like that's not. It's not healthy to do the other one. But there is like do a basic cleanse before you pick up enlivened objects. Yeah, you should do that.
Wash your
Like,
fucking hands.
wash your fucking hands before you serve people food is, that's just how it goes. Just a thing you should do. So when I'm saying beyond step one, I mean anything beyond those, what I consider to be basics.
This is a good
And
point.
that
Depends on the spirits, the action, the space for how spiritually clean you need to be.
exactly.
What Emily said.
What
yeah.
Emily said. Yeah. No, 100%. And it is very context dependent, and that's why I said enough, because there's a lot of heavy lifting being done by that word. But
Well, generally
throw it in
speaking, I agree with your definition of what beyond step one is. It's like, do you have the basics of the religion down? Do you have the basic jargon down? Do you have the worldview down? And are you practicing that? Because beyond step one implies that you're doing all of this and have done it enough to where it's integrated into your life.
I wouldn't even go that far for me when I say beyond step one, because I find for me personally that going beyond step one was how I integrated things into my life.
Okay.
But that's going to vary a lot person to person. So, it's going to depend a lot. I had a thought. It has fully fled. I will try to find it. Please continue. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I think one of the things that when it comes down to when I say beyond step one, part of the reason that I put so much emphasis on what step one really means is because once you go out of that initial little wading pool of information and practice, and I do not mean this as in a belittling fashion, it's the difference between, maybe not even a wading pool, it is the difference between your local pool where you're learning how to backstroke and the fucking ocean or the local lake. Like there is a heap of difference between a contained environment in which you can explore with relative safety and then the wild blue yonder where if you go past a certain point, the ocean is going to fucking eat you. You need to know how to swim before you decide to put yourself in the ocean. Or you need to be exceptionally supervised.
Yes.
By somebody with experience and the ability to pull you out of a riptide safely.
And frankly, both is better.
Right. But the main point that I'm getting to is like beyond step one involves risk on your part, really, in a very concrete way. Now, everything involves risk. Because if I approach my altars in an unclean way, I could set myself up for some consequences I may not want to deal with. And that is a very basic error that anybody could make. But the consequences are more incumbent on somebody who is supposed to know their shit and practice it.
100%. Heck, I've, as example of, you fucked up. A few months back, probably almost 6 months ago at this point, but beside the point. I was wearing a particular sacred object every day, and it was a necklace. And when I was at work at the time, and I kind of pulled it out of my shirt because the necklace was tangled up inappropriately. I was like, okay, let me fix this. And I didn't realize that a coworker was watching me while I did. They were like, what is that? Because it's not like a normal looking necklace. And I was like, very briefly, this is what it is. And they're like, can I touch it? And I said, sure. Kind of cautiously, but I was like, yeah, okay.
Oops.
And it was a immediately got told what you did wasn't wrong, but you will do a heavy cleanse of this object as soon as you are physically able to. So I got home, and the first thing that I had to do was take it off to a heavy cleanse and all of this. I was like, I'm not going to do that again. You're right, you're not. Yeah.
Yeah, letting somebody touch a particular sacred object is just not worth the amount of cleaning you have to do afterwards.
Yeah. And like some objects are fine with it. This one was kind of okay with it, but not very, and was like, you probably shouldn't have done that. So, what we're supposed to know? Well, we're supposed to know what we're practicing. Who knew? Yeah, no kidding. Um, Another good point, and this is a thing that we emphasized really heavily last show, is like the basics don't stop. These are things that you will always be doing. Like once you go beyond step one, you don't leave step one behind. You carry it with you.
Right.
You are still doing step one all the time. You're just doing other stuff on top of it. This is the part where spirit work starts to eat your fucking life, because it will do that.
If you let it, if you're set up for that, all the other caveats per usual. Emily also raises a good point. It depends on the object and who you're letting touch it. Like, I have less concern with the people that I know are really good spirit workers touching my stuff versus Joe Schmo who wants to walk up and touch my necklaces. And generally speaking, if I'm wearing a necklace out in public, I'm okay with Joe Public touching it because I know that people get curious and some people are more grabby than others. And I just rather not have to sit there and cleanse the shit out of something that's a pain in the ass to cleanse. This is a really good point too. Snarth has gotten bitten by so many of my things though.
And that's actually generally my concern with my sacred objects. It's less like, oh, I'm gonna have to do a bunch of cleaning work. Like, yeah, that's a thing, but that's not super stressful for me. A lot of it is, oh, this will bite you. Like, no, do not touch that. It will hurt you. It's just a thing. It will hurt you. I'm not kidding. I've had, like, there are certain of my objects that I do not let even other spirit workers touch without very explicit permission, that I generally do divination to confirm. Fast divination, but still, because some of those objects are grouchy, we will say.
Like in my case, I don't let many people touch my iron runes at all. It is very, very rare that I let somebody who's a client touch them. Partly because it's got some of my personal concerns on it. Like I've talked about this on the show before. My iron runes have my blood and other beings' blood on them, so they don't get touched very often. This is also because I know he has so many specific relationships. I'm extra careful with what I might hand him. That's also a very relevant point because there's certain spirits that I'm initiated with or to that it's just not a good idea for me to touch things that don't belong to me sometimes. Sometimes that's got to do with my wiring or the person's wiring or what the object's purpose is. And sometimes we're just at crossroads. Like I might really jive with the god or the spirit that's in that thing, but not in this context. Yeah.
Like there are a lot of my ritual objects for Freyr, like you and Freyr have a very good relationship. But I don't hand you those fucking things. Like
because there's those very specific relationships that I'm not to touch.
Yeah, and it's those are my priest tools. Like are you no, those are my priest tools. Don't fucking touch that shit. Like
exactly. This is also something too. So my special needs daughter placed a googly eye stone she made on an altar in front of my Caradwin statue, and I went to remove it, was scolded by for even touching it. So it stays.
Yeah. No, and that kind of thing happens too. So and it's important to note a lot of people will, or an observant listener might notice that divination is not a thing that we put into basics.
No.
I include things like critical thinking and discernment in my basics because those are things that I think are as important as any kind of spiritual hygiene. But also, like, I don't include divination. If you want to be doing divination, frankly, depending on the kind of divination you're doing and the tradition you're doing it in, that's very specialized work.
When it comes to heathenry, a lot of people will be like, oh, I want to learn how to do the rinse for divination. And I'm like, okay. And you can get very far with doing no initiation work with them. But I would be lying if I didn't say there were doors you can open without really meaning to, if you get, ass over tea kettle into that kind of practice. And there have been people that I've known who fell into working with the runes, and then now it's just like, oh, there's an entire dimension that's eating my life now. And I'm like, well, you kind of intentionally opened that door and said, come on in.
Yeah. I am very careful about how much I even talk about the pack spirits and the ways that I talk about them in public, because they have a habit of going off like an avalanche. It's
Right.
fine, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. And then very suddenly, oh, oops, I backdoored my way into something what is happening?
Right. Or some poor schmuck who you just met is now getting tapped by these spirits because they are very grabby hands.
Yeah. And it's like, and the pack spirits in particular are very big on consent. Their definitions of consent are different than ours, because it's more like, well, you made a choice. It's your fault. You didn't know what the consequences of that choice were.
You didn't ask.
You didn't ask. We assume you knew. You're here now. Congrats.
Right.
And so I'm very careful, because I would rather stick to the areas where I know from experience I can talk about this and it's fine, than accidentally set something off.
Part of the reason I put divination in beyond step 1 is because of how much spiritual contact you can get just from doing basic divination.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true regardless of if you're using a fucking magic 8-ball or if you're learning the tarot. I mean, if you're learning the tarot in a classical system, you're going to incorporate a lot of different methods of occultism into it, or your average tarot book is going to.
Yeah.
And so there's a laundry list of shit you can learn depending on the context of the tarot you're reading and the background of how that particular deck was put together. Is it dedicated? Is it spirit led? Is it a spirit unto itself? Or is it a whole collection of spirits? There's an entire menagerie of shit you can open up with just a tarot deck.
Yep. And, there's, going back to worldview and stuff, divination systems are always couched in worldview.
Correct.
Right? They are always couched in this worldview and context. And if you don't understand that, you might get some of the information out of it, but you won't get the full thing. You won't get the full picture. And that's important. If you don't have all of that, it's going to be really hard. Another thing is, going back to an example we had earlier of, like, I'm doing divination for a client and they've got a really nasty spiritual attachment. That spirit who is attached to them and is actively dangerous might be really mad at me for doing divination and start trying to mess with me in a variety of ways. Simplest is they could just try to block the divination, up to and including try to attach to me. I've had that happen. It's not fun.
Right. But in order for you to recognize that, you have to have all of this couched in your worldview, the practice that you've got. The divination system has to be able to account for it, or you have to be able to account for it within using that system. Mm-hmm. And you have to have enough expertise to recognize when you're being blocked. There's an entire laundry list of stuff that's beyond step 1 that starts getting into, and I'm going to use this kind of haphazardly, like 201, 301 territory.
Fully, yes. And like, you can do, are we making this a little bigger than it is? Yes and no. I do think that basic divination is, in most cases, 201 stuff, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like reading for other people, reading for clients, that's different, I think. I think
right.
that's at least a 301, more likely a 401 or graduate level thing. But I do...
I'm laughing because when I became a pagan back in 2004, I dove into the deep end of the pool partly because I had to, because the resources I had available were so thin on the ground. And my context was I was a very devout Catholic who had walked away from the church and walked away from salvation. By fuck, I was going to pick something up that had an equivalent spiritual weight because I didn't give up salvation for nothing. Okay. Within a year, I was reading tarot for other people professionally. And this is where I go, I don't fucking recommend this for people.
Well, one, that, and two, also this is where like years in is not the same thing as experience level.
Correct.
Right? Someone who does, and this is not disparaging, and I want to be very clear about that. There is nothing wrong with the first example I'm about to say, but someone who does 101, who does the basics for 20 years, will have very deep, very strong relationships, devotional relationships, most likely, and be very good at the basics. And that doesn't imply anything beyond that, right? Do I want that person in a ritual setting? Yeah, sure. I'm sure that they can hold their own. But also, I'm going to have to teach them a lot. Are they going to be teachable? That's dependent on the person. And that is also different from someone who has, for 20 years, done like, oh, you know, I offer on the holidays.
Right.
These people have been doing things for the same amount of time. One person does it every day, and one person does it mostly on the holidays.
Every 6
Which
weeks.
holidays? You know, every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks. Oh, I mostly just do a solar thing, so it's really 4 times a year. Okay, that's a very different thing than every single day.
Right. And I mean, like again, I'm going to use my Catholicism background as a backdrop for this. There is a difference between an Easter and Christmas Catholic and a Catholic who prays their rosary, does their devotionals, and is an engaged member of the church. There is a wealth of difference, and the church recognizes that.
Yeah.
And that's baseline shit. And that's just a lay person in the Catholic Church. Surely we can apply the same kind of rigor, maybe not the same rhetoric, please, but
no, but you can. The idea is the same, right? I saw an example on Facebook recently, of all fucking places, but
nuance on my Facebook.
Several of the like groups that I'm a part of that are actually quite legit are on Facebook, because it's a lot of like older folks who don't do other social media, and I'm like, all right, fine, I guess I will keep Facebook for this one specific thing, and that's
if it wasn't for the pagan community, I'd be off the fucking thing too. I get you.
Yeah, 100%. But like, you know, the person posting was, I believe, a Tibetan Buddhist talking about some of their experience with martial arts, actually, and how, like, kind of talking about the same thing, how, like, someone who has 30 years of experience and they do, like, some every weekend or something, like, they're going to be pretty good.
Right.
That is not the same thing as someone who has, for 5 years, been practicing 10 hours a day.
Right.
You know, that person with 5 years of 10 hours a day is going to have a lot more experience. They have more hours in the bank than the person who does it every weekend, even for a few hours a day, you know, for 20 years. They have more hours in the bank, and that's a lot of it, right? When you say I dove in face first, I know exactly what you mean, because I did the same fucking thing, and it's, oh, this ate my life immediately. I spent at least 4 hours a day, probably more like 8, at least doing basic stuff, and sometimes a lot more than basic stuff, every day.
Well, I mean, when you're moving from one belief system to another, there's, you know, the conversion, zealotry, excitement thing, the new relationship energy that comes with embracing a new worldview. You see this in reverse with anti-theists who are new anti-theists. They are incredibly evangelical with their anti-theism. With reason. I can understand that, even if I don't like anti-theism, and I don't. But I get it.
Yeah.
Because I was much the same, but in reverse. When I moved from monotheism to polytheism, it was a complete world shift for me, and I wanted to eat everything with regards to that. Really quick, Destiny has a really good point.
Additionally, ethical issues and proper boundaries on both sides are really important to cover before even considering professional reading. Absolutely, and I would say that this applies for all professional work, not just reading.
Any professional work.
Whether spiritual or not, but that's a touch beside the point on this podcast. And Emily says, just like a honeymoon period in a relationship when you're all about the other person all of the time for a while. Yeah, right. The new relationship energy, the honeymoon period, all of that. Yeah, it's really easy to get swept up and dive in super deep and then be like, oh shit, I'm
drowning.
Drowning. I am so far from shore. Do I know how to swim? What's happening? That's a very easy thing to do. And that's also why Sarenth and I are consistently like, hey, the thing that I'm very excited about, and like in the catching up, here's what I've been up to lately. Don't fucking do that. That's super dangerous. That's not ooh, I'm better than you, I can do the dangerous thing. It's no, what I'm doing is dangerous. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't have to. I'm excited about it because it is also a thing that I am excited about, but that's also that doesn't negate the danger of it. Right?
So I just had my being a spirit worker workshop pop off Sunday. And it's one of the things that I kept telling people, like, if you don't have to pick up being a spirit worker, fucking don't.
Yeah.
Don't. Not because it's bad, not because I regret becoming a spirit worker, but because there's so much you can do without having that in charge of your life. Because more often than not, what I find is when people become spirit workers, that becomes their very first priority before family, friends, life itself. Yeah. And that, to my mind, as a spirit worker who has that priority system, that is as it should be. And I say that without putting that on every spirit worker out there. However,
and it's a tense thing though, because often, like today, I got pulled into, and it wasn't super intense. It only took like 18, 20 minutes. But I got pulled into a phone call where I was doing some consultation, and it was important that I be there. And today is the first day I've had off of work in like 4 or 5 days. I'm working midnights. I'm doing 12s. My partner was upset because this is the first time we've had a meal together in a week.
Right.
And in the middle of it, I got pulled into something. And it was important, and I cut it as short as I could so I could get back as quickly as I could, and they were okay. And they understand because they're also a spirit worker and they get it. But like, they were upset, and they had every right to be upset.
They have a right to be.
They have a right to be upset. And also, I still had to go do this thing.
Right.
Had to is strong. I could have said no. It would have been inappropriate for me to say no. It's largely my job to go do stuff like that. And this was the thing that I really should have been doing. I could have said no.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
I want to emphasize, when you're going beyond step one, you don't have to pick up job titles if you don't want to. If you don't absolutely have to pick up a job title, fucking don't. Be a free agent for as long as you possibly can.
Yeah.
Finn has this to say, me and Odin all those years ago jumped in head first way too fucking fast. Right. And there are certain gods and spirits who encourage that shit.
Yeah. I would say any god or spirit is capable of that.
I would too.
Some have a more of a reputation for it. And most of the time that reputation is earned, but I would say anyone can.
I would agree.
That said, and I've got a blog post that I've referenced before about like, dangerous gods and how most of the time that reputation is completely unearned or at least wildly overblown.
Right.
That said, if Odin's poking around, be cautious, because he's got that reputation for a reason, and so do a lot of the other gods. Morgan has that reputation for a reason. She has a tendency to pick people up and just do what she's going to do with them. And any god can do that, but some have that reputation for a reason.
beyond step one doesn't necessarily mean becoming a spirit worker. There are a lot of options depending on your definition of spirit worker. Absolutely. And this is why we're pointing out divination and other forms of spiritual involvement. And to be clear, divination does not mean automatically spirit work.
Mhm.
It just might be spiritual engagement, spiritual discernment, spiritual work that you're interested in doing for yourself and for others, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be a spirit worker as in the job title.
Very much. And for what it's worth, I want to echo that I agree with Sarenth. If you don't have to pick up a job title, if you don't have to pick up work, I would recommend you don't, or at least think about it very carefully and ask as many questions as you can so that you know what it is you are buying.
Right.
Right? Like, just because Trouble is on sale does not mean that you have to go buy some. You can leave it on the shelf.
I think
I tell Sarenth that all the time.
No, and it's a very good lesson. So beyond step one, I really want to pick up on this because we've talked a kind of wide ranging. So when you're immediately off the beaten path, I think you're starting to get beyond step one. Like if you're working on your own personal spiritual experiences beyond the things that you've read, beyond the things that are basic to your religious and spiritual and magical pathway, I think that beyond step one is a lot of experiential stuff. And it's why books beyond 101 in a lot of occult and pagan booksellers don't do as well, because it's oftentimes it comes down to very niche or nicheified interests. Like if you're asking, well, what divination system works for me? You're going to have to experiment at some level. Because if the tarot doesn't mean anything to you, like I tried astrology for fucking years and I'm hopeless at it. And I took that pressure off myself, partly because there were other people who were fucking brilliant at it, but also I don't need to know everything. And that's why you go to specialists.
Very much. And yeah, and I would say, direct spiritual experiences, divination, spirit work beyond basic devotionals, anything where you are engaging directly with gods and spirits in a way that goes beyond just the devotional, I think is beyond step one. And I think there are levels to it, and there are ways to wade in slowly and not just dive in.
Right. And I do not think, just to be very fucking clear, that spirit work is the do-all end-all, nor should it be ever.
No, very much no.
I also don't think that having a singular niche interest is a bad thing. Like if you keep a singular niche interest for 20 fucking years, I have ADHD. That's really neat. I've picked up and put down so many fucking hobbies in the interim that I've been alive. Sometimes because the dopamine hits aren't there, and that's not a bad thing. It just means that somebody who picked up doing forge work, blacksmithing 20 years ago, and has only ever done blacksmithing is going to be way more advanced than the one fucking knife I helped make.
Yeah. And just because you're picking up, we've talked a lot about how like expertise is domain specific. You can be a great fucking diviner and never touch possessory work.
Yep.
You don't need. You might get called to it, but if you aren't, don't.
Okay.
Like, cool. And sometimes, sometimes they go hand in hand, and sometimes they don't, and that's fine. And not everything that you can do, there are plenty of topics that are 201 without being, this is fucking rocket surgery and you'll kill someone if you fuck up.
What are some? Okay, so we've talked really, really broad.
Yeah.
And let's kind of narrow our focus a little bit. So if somebody's out of step one, which is again the basics, TM, what does step 2 look like?
That for me is where I get into personally, where I get into direct experiences with gods and spirits, where you're not just making offerings, but you are having conversations more or less, um, and not just like basic petitions, but like, hey, I need help with this specific thing. Can you come help with that? And expecting to see a change. It might
Right.
not be immediate, but expecting to see a change. Um, it might be divination is probably going to be my go-to here. I'm going to start people off with a basic, relatively safe, and kind of narrow focused divination system. Sorry, I'm also logging into my computer because my phone's starting to die, so I'm gonna see
Oh
if I
no.
can't switch back to my computer. But we're okay for now. I'm doing that in the background. So I would say, like someone picking up tarot is generally fine. In most contexts, I would say, um, in most pagan contexts, I don't actually think tarot's that good. I think that you're going to be better off with a worldview specific divination system. So if
Mhm.
you're in heathenry, then I think the runes make a lot more sense. And so I would start in a like teaching context. I would say, okay, cool. So you want to start picking up divination? Cool, fine. That is a good skill that you should have.
Yep.
Let's introduce you to the runes. Here's how I understand them. Let's go from there. I would say even stuff like, and this is gonna sound maybe a little silly, but stuff like spontaneous prayers,
Mhm.
spontaneous prayers, devotional poetry, like inspired devotional poetry, um, crafting specific holidays. And the context that I say that in is, for me, it is holidays are always holy days, right? They are divinely inspired.
Right.
Um, myth writing is another area where it's like at least partly divinely inspired. Sometimes it is just at least partly just to make sense of your mythos and maybe plug holes, but I would say that it should be at least partly divinely inspired. Um, if it's not, I don't know that you can call it myth, but that's
Mhm.
a personal thing, and may not apply to everyone. So, definitions.
Really quick, I want to point this out.
Yeah.
Yeah, the lessons I learned with Odin have helped me along the way with the Morgan. She's going to do what she's going to. And I think this is actually a kind of a solid piece of step 2 is that you can apply the basic lessons you got in step 1 because it's not just about getting feedback. It's also, can you apply what you learn?
Mm-hmm. Very much.
Like if you've got a polytheist or animist worldview, the implications of that should start manifesting in how you treat the world around you. For me,
Very
it's step
much.
2. It's like, how am I to live in the world? Step 1 is like, what's my place in the world? And then step 2 is like, how do I live in this world now that I have this worldview?
Yeah. Oh, no.
I think their computer just kicked on. You're going to have to pick one of the profiles, my friend.
Okay. Now that I don't have Echo City, I'm gonna try switching to my computer because I'm on 7% on my phone.
Good luck.
I'm gonna stay on this just in case, so that we can at least have something. Give me a second.
Okay. So I could remove your phone and then put your laptop on the stage. There you go.
Okay, cool. Can you hear me?
Way better.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to go ahead and get off of here so that my phone doesn't die so that we can continue talking.
Okay.
Welcome to Musical Computers.
The thing for me, like when you're solidly in step 2, it's like all the implications that you've onboarded in step 1 start becoming apparent and you start applying them to your life. And this is true whether you're talking about discernment, because it's like I've read the myths, I understand the myths well enough to at least apply some of them to my life. This doesn't imply that you have to like have complete mastery over the myths and you like understand all the context. It's like you have all your life to learn the nuances. So, give yourself some of that grace. But also, this is where a lot of the metal of your life starts meeting the meat of your practice. And this, in terms of discernment, it's like Jim's spiritual accounting is the 3-legged stool of lore, community, and divination. That to me is like step 2 basic stuff, because then you're tabulating the experiences you have with the gods, ancestors, and Vater you're sharing your life with. And I think it's an act of living with in a lot of these cases rather than I'm involved in.
Yes, I would very much agree. And speaking of community thing, I think it's also where you start drawing inspiration from other traditions, either like inspiration specifically from open practices, or receiving direct teachings from lineage traditions is also a good way to break beyond step 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, most of these are closed traditions, so, do your due diligence and all of that. That comes with a lot of caveats, but that's another spot that I think is worth mentioning, is that you don't have to just forge all of it your own fucking self. Like, there are teachers out there.
Right.
They are few and hard to find, and there are definitely a lot of costs associated with that, some of it monetary, some of it not. But it's worth noting that, like, neo-paganism is neo, and anyone who's like, oh, I come from an unbroken Norse heathen tradition that goes back 2,000 years. No, you don't. Fuck you. Like, you might come from a folk tradition that has some elements of the old religions in it, but like it's a broken tradition. We're gonna move on from that. But there are unbroken traditions, and there are revived traditions that are 200 years old instead of
50.
20, or 50 years old, right? Like, so if they are willing to teach, it is a good idea to listen.
Yeah, because 50 years ago was what, 1975?
Yeah.
So a lot of neo-pagan traditions come from about 50 to 60 years on average here in America. And that doesn't mean that they're invalid. It doesn't mean that they're less than a lineage tradition. It just means they don't have the cultural cachet or the lineages that keep people, in some cases, safer or more together than what we have now. But that's not to say that we don't have multiple generations at this point. We actually do.
Yeah.
Destiny has some really good points too. To me, it seems that this is the intersection of spiritual practice and personal interest for possible practice or specialization would come in handy.
Yeah.
Before looking for a teacher, what are you looking to learn? Yeah, that.
Yeah. Very much. Yeah. And that is a slight tangent and not directly kind of bouncing off of anything that we were saying of, like, I don't think that looking for a teacher in a lineage tradition or anything fits cleanly into a 201, 301 master's degree, whatever.
It doesn't.
It doesn't at all. And I don't think it's required, but I do think it's a good idea. And I think it's enough of a good idea that it's worth mentioning on its own. And I was going to forget if I didn't frickin' say it.
Yeah. I think too, like the thing that some folks will get into is like, once you start assigning numbers to things, it'll be like a hierarchy of better. And that's not necessarily what we're talking about here.
Not at all.
Like if you stay in step 1, that doesn't make you inherently more or less holy than me.
No.
It doesn't make me more or less holy than you if I go to step 3, 4, 5, or 6.
No.
It just means that I'm walking in this particular direction and here's the steps to get there.
Exactly. No, it's worth, and it's a careful balance, right? Because it is worth honoring skill and ability and learning in a given field, regardless of what that field is.
Yep.
A doctor is a valuable person. A medical doctor is a valuable person and should be respected for the fact that they have their skill, ability, all of that.
Yep.
That does not make them a better person than the janitor.
Nope. In many cases, you need both, because the janitor keeps everything safe and sanitary, and the doctor makes sure you know what the fuck you're looking at is genuine.
Yeah, right. Like both of these jobs are necessary, and pretending that one is better is actively a lie. So,
when you apply this to things like step 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., the trap you can fall into is better than, more holy than, or more relevant to the community. And I don't really agree with any of that, because everybody who's in community is relevant to the community.
Yes. I would also say that, again, it's very domain specific, right? Someone who is a PhD diviner could be utter garbage at exorcism. And
Yeah.
a brilliant exorcist who can remove extremely difficult spiritual attachments, who can depossess someone very easily, quickly, and safely, might look at every divination system and be like, I can sometimes get a yes or a no. Both of these people have deep skill sets that the other does not have.
Yep. Sometimes you have an aptitude for something. Sometimes you've developed skills over a long period of life. Sometimes you just don't have the interest. All of these things are valid.
Yep.
A lot of beyond step 1, in my view, is where does your interest, aptitude, and talent lie? And is it relevant to your life path at this point?
Yeah.
And relevancy is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because if you're being pushed to do divination because nobody in your community can divine, you might be by proxy the diviner for that area, but it doesn't mean that you can't put down that hat later on if somebody comes along and does a better job and you don't have the interest anymore.
Yep.
It also doesn't mean you're in fucking competition. Also
very much yes. In fact, I prefer to have multiple redundancies of every skill set that I can find. I'm very happy to have, and so much as I am able to teach to people when there is interest, and within my ability, but especially with divining, when it comes to discernment, I will, for any major question, I will go to at least 3 diviners.
Yep. Same.
And at least 2 of them are blind to the situation to start and give me as much information as they can blindly before anything else.
I think too, there's also an important step beyond step 1, and that is once you hit step 2, you are at step 1 for that step.
Yes.
Because when it comes to like the runes, I tell people, unless you really need to, like, it's okay to not blood the runes, because that might bring you into a certain initiatory divination relation, or not divination, excuse me, in a certain initiatory relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can have multiple steps inside the same step depending on where you're trying to go with your practice and what direction you're being pulled towards, if you're being pulled towards anything.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is like really broad-based advice, partly because everybody's pathway is different, but also after step one, like beyond saying these are the basics of heathenry, these are what this looks like my rune divination may look exactly like somebody else, and they will get entirely different information out of the same exact reading. Like I have had a situation where I've pulled literally the same runes as other rune readers on a given thing, got entirely separate information.
Yeah.
So like that is like, to me, like that is a step one of step two. Like it is like step two, and this is sub step one of your mileage may vary.
Yeah.
Explore.
Your first day in class should look very different than your last day in class, and if they don't, that's actually a problem.
Right. I mean, and it's not actually like okay, you've got this one guidebook that was really excellent, never pick it up again. Your relationship to your initial materials is likely to change the further in the rearview mirror your first moment of doing X is. Because I have studied the rune poems for literally years. And there are some rune poems that are very relevant when I read, and some that only very occasionally pop up.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't that long ago. This was a couple of years ago, but I remember I was in the middle of another session where I was going through the rune poems pretty deeply again, and I did some reading for you and pointed out a line in one of the rune poems that you had forgotten existed.
Yep.
And it applied so specifically to your situation. I was like, this line in the poem is what is happening.
I think it was Perthrow because it stuck with me since.
Yeah, right. And it was princes sit blithely in the hall together or something like that. And I was like, this is what's going on. And you were like, fuck you. God damn it. Fuck you.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to catch you all later. Work come early in the morning. Great show as always. I plan to be back. Love you all. Love you too, Finn. It's good to see you.
Yeah.
And again, I had been studying the rune poems for literally years, and I still would occasionally forget shit like that.
Mm-hmm.
And also sometimes it's literally like Perthrow does not come up very often in the readings I get or in the readings I give.
Yeah.
Why would I memorize it? Because I'm not actively thinking about it.
Yeah. And the meaning changes, right?
Right.
And it changes also based on relationship. Like Ivaz, for you is a completely different rune than it is for me, because you associate it with Odin and I associate it with Angerbotha.
Mm-hmm.
These are wildly different things.
Absolutely.
Do these two gods share a lot of characteristics? They sure do, but that doesn't mean that the context is very different, though. And part of that context too is also my relationship with Angerbotha is different. Another example is Thurisaz, for most people, most of the time, is a very negative rune. It's a no. Almost every reader, that I've come across who does runes, if they are doing a yes/no question, Thurisaz pops up, it's a no. For me, Thurisaz pops up, I have to ask again, does this mean yes or does this mean no? Because one of the lines in the rune poem for Thurisaz is husband of the giantess.
Yep.
So sometimes, not always, but sometimes Thurisaz is either referring to me or is a yes if it's about kind of specific things for Jotnar or with Angerbotha specifically, or kind of in that realm.
Right. Well, this is also where, like, are you going to read reverse runes or not? This is widely disagreed because people are like, well, this is just an import from the tarot, so fuck that noise, which is valid.
Mm-hmm.
But I get a lot of information based on position.
Yeah. And for me,
also
it actually
valid.
Absolutely. For me, it depends on my rune set. One of my rune sets, the stones are quite round, so they roll and spin anyway. As soon as I set them down, they move. If I were to read reverse runes with those, it wouldn't work super well because they move, right? I don't have a set position for them. My other one though, they're flat. They're obsidian, so the structure of the stone is very flat. Those, if I get a reverse Ansu's, I immediately get the feeling of hanging gone bad. It is a reverse Ansu's is the hardest no that I can get. Like, it is all things gone bad and putrid and wrong. Like, something that can be good gone as wrong as it possibly can.
Right.
It is the hardest no I can get, and I only get that with one specific rune set because I only have the two, and the one doesn't do reversals, like physically doesn't do them. So that's it.
I also should point out I use a if I need a quick dirty rune or tarot answer, I have apps on my phone for that shit, and some people will never touch that in their divination practice. So even on very baseline levels, your mileage may vary beyond step one based on what is valid to you. A lot of beyond step one is figuring out what is useful, valid, and relevant for you in your practice.
And a lot of this is based on cosmology and worldview, right? As an example, Jason, who we've had on the show a number of times, Jason and I were trained initially by the same person at almost the exact same time. Like, we did a lot of our initial training physically in the room together.
Right.
We do things, and Jason is a phenomenal spirit worker, and I have the highest respect for him. Same. I go to him for help all the time. And also, we do things very differently. Why? Because he runs in Hellenismo circles. He's a Hellenic. I don't do that shit, right? Like, the answer is we do things quite differently, even though we were trained by the same person.
Right.
And part of that is skill set, and part of that is calling, which also it's worth emphasizing. I meant to say this earlier and forgot. Calling isn't everything, and
it's not.
You don't have to be called to a thing. You can just pick something up because you're interested in it. And also not being called to something, like we were talking about with a janitor versus doctor thing. Like, you're not called to medical school, don't go to medical school. That doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you not going to medical school. That's full stop. There is no moral value here.
Right. And also to emphasize, your valuation is not dependent on service in or to the community in that fashion. Just being a member of the community in good standing is enough.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of where I come to step 2 and beyond is like a very big watchword for me is enough.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you want to go deeper, there's all the depth you can handle and then some. And that can go for damn near any practice you could think of. But what is enough for you? What is enough for the context of the role you want to play or not play? Destiny, this is a good point. Sometimes the interest is the calling.
Yeah. No, you're not wrong there.
But I think that we overemphasize being called to gods. And I'm part of this conversation too, because I've been blogging for 15 fucking years now. If not, well, actually, it's more than that. I've been blogging since blogs were a thing, but I am part of the problem while recognizing that my experiences are not universal, never should be held up as universal. Because calling isn't everything.
100%. And for example, because calling often, in my experience, implies a lack of choice, or at least a choice so loaded that it's, in many cases, hardly a choice.
Yeah.
The classic example of this is Mongolian shamans who are called, and you don't really get technically you get a choice. You could run from it, but that
then you and your family get to deal with that.
Yeah, right. That generally results in shaman sickness, which can be anything from like debilitating physical illness to insanity or both. Um, Bloodline curses, all kinds of shit, right? And that's not to deride the system, like full respect. But that's kind of the thing, right? Like that's one of the diagnostic criteria is did you get shaman sickness? No? Okay, well then there's other questions. And this is a system where I'm talking beyond my expertise, but like that's kind of the classic example.
Right.
Uh, the pack spirits don't have that.
Right.
Right? I said yes. They called and I said yes. If I'd said no, I wasn't gonna get shaman sickness. That's not a thing. But now that I have picked it up, if I put it down, it would kill me.
Yep.
Like, it wouldn't be like, oh, I immediately keel over from a heart attack. It would just be, no,
This isn't Death Note, right?
Yeah, right. This isn't Death Note, but it is, no, it would eventually kill me.
You'd waste away or something else.
I'd waste away and then I'd get sick and then I just wouldn't get better.
Yep. And I think this is, beyond step one, some of these things are worth considering more than others. Especially when you're talking about different initiated pathways. This is where knowing what's going to be required of you and asking a lot of questions is really important. This is also where, what am I willing to put up with? What is my goal with this? What spiritual relationships am I willing or not willing to have is also really important. Emily says, also, I think depending on the choices you make, sometimes callings will come afterward, which is kind of what Maleck is saying. Yeah.
Very, very much agree. Where it's like,
if you keep on with this, here's the consequences. Are you sure you want to do this?
That, and also, and kind of a thing that I think Emily is saying is, cool, well, I picked up, I said yes. Well, now there's a whole bunch of things that I am called to. And my choices are
do it or die.
Yeah, kind of. Like I could say no, and there is always negotiation, right? You can always negotiate. But what position are you negotiating from? Is it one of where you can just say no? Or is it one where if you say no, there's going to be consequences?
Right.
And those consequences could be very minor. Or they could be major. And that's really hard to say without being in the thick of it.
I think beyond step one, when you're talking about getting this far along the path, speaking of particular niches or particular interests or particular directions, some people blaze a trail and it's very bright. Some people let the forest envelop them and show them where to go. And these are very dynamically different approaches to walking in the forest. And I think that when we're talking about beyond step one and when we're getting into particulars of practice, and part of why I don't really want to, part of the reason why I pick on the runes so damn much is because they're really accessible, but they're also really, really, really deep. And the depth you go to them in some ways depends on where you take that relationship. But it also depends on what you have or haven't accepted in terms of where your baseline is. There's a lot of variation of practice. There's a lot of variation of this is useful to you. If you have a background in tarot, reversals might make a lot of sense to you. If you don't have a background in tarot and you're just learning the rune poems, reversals might make no goddamn sense at all. As a very baseline idea. And when it comes to, okay, do I want to follow Othin's initiatory pathway? That's an entire separate side conversation that the runes are involved in, but that's like step 3, 4, 5, 6, depending on where you're at in that milieu.
Yeah.
So part of the difficulty of having these conversations is unless we get really deep in the fucking weeds on some of this stuff, we're talking really broad based by dint of until you're in the thick of it and you're like, wow, where am I putting my feet?
And that's the thing that I was trying to say earlier and didn't say super well is like it's really hard to say because so much of it is determined by context and cosmology, right?
Right.
The cosmology of Hellenismos is very different. There are certainly some overlap, but it's very different than a heathen cosmology, right? There's overlap, but it's not the same thing. And trying to say these are one-to-ones doesn't really work very well.
I think to pick up on that a little bit, there is a very big fucking difference between approaching gods from a Stoic versus a Platonist versus a postmodern mindset. A very, very, very big fucking difference that is really hard to overemphasize. And I think that's some of where step 2 lies is, okay, I've got the basics of the path as I understand it. What's my philosophy of approach? And some people are going to get really deep with it. Some people aren't. Some people are going to just be like, I take the gods on their own terms, and it doesn't matter to me if it's Platonist or Stoic or postmodern or modernist or whatever. They don't give a shit. And it's not relevant. But that's where a lot of these questions start becoming relevant, because that depends on how you approach the gods on a baseline in relationship.
Yeah. Right, like a Platonist approach to divinity where the gods are all good, capital G,
right,
is wildly different than like how I approach it, where the gods are not all good. I don't believe that all good exists. I don't believe that capital E evil exists. I think that there are relative good and evils, and this is a wildly different approach. For me, approaching the gods is dangerous. If you're doing it in beyond a basic devotional thing, it's dangerous. Why? Because power is always dangerous. That doesn't mean they mean you harm, but power is always dangerous. It is the ability to enact change. Change can be harm.
I'm laughing because the quote that keeps popping up, even from the beginning of this episode in my head, is C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. Aslan is not a tame lion.
Exactly. Right? Like, not a tame lion is a very good descriptor for how I see the gods, right? That doesn't mean that they're antagonistic or malicious, right? These are not the same thing. Dangerous and antagonistic are not the same word, and they don't mean the same thing.
Right.
So when I say the gods are dangerous, that doesn't mean that you should be afraid of them. It means you should be cautious, as you should be when you pick up a gun. There are rules, and you should follow them, because breaking them is dangerous. If you point a gun at someone, you are breaking the rules unless you are trying to harm them.
Right. I mean, it's like getting into a car or taking a walk down the street. If you don't obey the rules of the road as a pedestrian, you put yourself and other people at risk. You have that power. The people who are driving the cars as you're walking along the sidewalk have a great deal of power if they decide to swerve onto the sidewalk.
Yep.
Generally speaking, the reason that our roads operate the way they do is because people obey the rules of the road.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, I would say that gods don't override our free will for the most part, or don't put us in positions where a particular outcome must happen, because that puts us all in a bind.
Yep.
In a bind that makes it mutually destructive at some level.
Yeah. I tend to agree. But
I think there's exceptions.
Yeah,
but
for sure. It's also, that is a very different outlook and approach than, at least my understanding as someone who's not a Platonist, of most Neoplatonist approaches, which are the gods are all good. They cannot do harm. It is physically impossible for them to do harm on a large scale. Now, harm on a small scale, but that's only perceived harm, not true harm.
Right. And there's a whole philosophical discussion to be had that we're not going to get too deep in the weeds on tonight.
Right. That gets into problem of evil stuff, which is
the Odyssey is a pain in the ass.
Yeah. But that is,
when you're beyond step 1, you need to have a concept of what good, evil, right, wrong, all this shit looks like.
Yeah.
Not only from a perspective of what's a good way to approach God's ancestors and spirits and yourself, but also what do some of these larger questions imply?
Yeah. Right. if you are going beyond step one, you're gonna run into the problem of evil, and you're gonna have to deal with it. The dealing with it can be, but you will have to deal with it eventually.
Right.
Yeah.
But so much of your approach dictates so much of what step two looks like for you. And I mean you in the broad-based pagan communities, heathen communities, magical communities, like what your baseline approach is and all your ethical considerations from there and all your practical considerations from there makes it really hard to say this is absolutely what step two looks like. But we can at least point to some broad-based things. And ethical considerations are one of them to me. How you use and think about power is another part of step two.
Yeah.
Or do you? Because there's certain religions where pacifism is the rule.
Yeah.
Like I'm thinking of the Pythagoreans, where vegetarianism was the rule. You did not eat meat. Why?
Yeah.
Because you were trying to be as low impact on the earth as possible.
Yeah. No, I can think of several philosophies where the accumulation of power, especially the intentional accumulation of power, is tantamount to sin.
Yep. Yeah.
For me, it's not.
Right.
I think the intentional accumulation of power is natural and a thing that people do and can be used for evil or can be used for good, capital E or lowercase e, lowercase g.
Right.
And those things are relative based on the intent, skill, and the intent of the user, the skill and ability of the user, and the outcome. The outcome being the most important of those, but informed by the prior two, right?
Yeah. I think also right action. I know this is part of like ethical consideration, but like what right thought and right action looks like in different contexts is also where you kind of get into the weeds at step two. Because if in this context I have the choice of A or B, what is the better choice really depends on the approach that I'm coming from. Like, again, I'm going to use divination with the runes as an example. Do you use a casting cloth? Do you use an animal skin? Like I have a rabbit skin. I have a rabbit skin that I've had as long as I've had my runes. And, you know, some people will be like, I don't use any animal products at all. Like there are vegan heathens out there and they have a very particular way that they ethically practice that I don't agree with and I don't vibe with, but they're still heathen nonetheless.
Absolutely.
And we've still gotten past step one.
Yep.
So yeah, like this is also where community and living in community really meets where you're at. Like, how do you interact with community? Do you interact with community? Is that just something you're not fucking interested in? All of these are considerations. Step one and step two kind of blend those together, I think.
Yeah. Because
sometimes it's like, do I have community around me or am I all online? What's the context? Again, a lot of step two and beyond are all context dependent.
Yeah, they really are. And I mean, step one isn't not context dependent. It's just that we've covered the context of that kind of to death last episode. So
yeah.
But yeah, and I would say, and we're a bit talking in circles now, but that's okay.
I think to a certain degree, like it's impossible not to, because unless you've got somebody who's like directly asking you relevant questions, like here's where I'm at, it's really hard to like broad-based explain this. Mm-hmm. Or even to just like explore beyond a very simple route, because there's going to be some aspects of it where you're going to pick up, say, rune practice, and you're going to be trailblazing because there's nothing in the rune lore about this, that, or the other thing. You've got an interpretation of a word.
Yeah.
Like I think to the extra runes with the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc. Mm-hmm. Stan might be stone, it might be chalk. That's it. You don't have a rune poem. What do you do with it?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's
I'm sorry, not Stan. Stan is stone. I'm thinking of calc. Excuse me.
Okay, that makes a little more sense. yeah, and that's like when you had me write the blog post about how would I train someone
Right.
with no experience in pack tradition, and it was like, okay, I am going to be making these, and I spent multiple paragraphs talking about the assumptions I was making
Right.
about this person that I was training, and if any one of these assumptions is not true, everything that I write after that is no longer valid and has to be readdressed.
Yep. I spend a lot of the supposition topic questions I get having to do a lot of disclaiming and couching in context, because the conversations that we're trying to have in theory are so nuanced based on who we're working with and how. Like, if somebody's like, I don't want to work with Odin at all, how do I be a good heathen working with the runes? I'm like, oh, that's don't work with Odin. I think at some point you might have to at least address him, but he doesn't have to be your main squeeze. There's plenty of other gods and spirits that have access to the runes. For instance, the entire list of gods and spirits that are named in the Havamal that he gave the fucking runes to.
Yeah. Very much, yes. Or just even other gods and spirits aside, and just approaching the runes, just the spirits themselves.
Right.
You know, just dealing with them directly is also okay. Now, I do think that Odin and the runes are tied up together in such a way that I don't think you can get away with not at least saying hi.
Correct. I feel the same way. But I've known people who have serious beef with Odin who still get great results with the runes. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, a lot of this is context dependent. A lot of this is where you're coming out of and how you're walking.
Yeah. Oh, so we are approaching 2 hours very quickly. We should probably wrap up.
Yep.
What are you drinking tonight?
Coffee.
That's it?
I drink coffee and water and a little bit of Diet Pepsi. That's it. You?
So I had poured myself a blind Russian, but apparently my Irish cream has gone bad because it curdled into almost a solid block.
Ew.
It's super disgusting. So you haven't seen me take more than like 2 sips all night because I was like, oh, this is curdling. Never mind. So that's super fun.
No, I seriously made like a 9 scoop coffee pot before I came on, and like I've been nursing 1 cup the whole evening because I pre-gamed with like 3 cups of coffee before I started.
Nice. Yeah.
So-
For the after party, I will be making probably a couple of coffee cocktails, and because I got to be up until like 4 or 5 in the morning. So
Got you. So with all that said, I think we've really kind of said as much as we possibly can without somebody asking us direct questions at this point about which direction to take this conversation from here.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like any further conversation, we're just going to drive the point even further into the ground as we walk in a circle.
Yeah. No, I tend to agree. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts?
I think that if you're transitioning from step 1 to other steps, asking yourself ethical questions, what your relationship to power, what your relationships ideally look like, and what you are and are not willing to accept are really important, because these questions set you up for the kinds of relationships you will want to explore going forward, and the kinds of things that you will and will not accept into your life. And what is beyond the pale for you is really important to figure out now before you're confronted with something where it's like, wow, that's beyond the pale. I don't have much of a choice now.
Yep. Very much agree. Also, if you think that you are going beyond step 1, if you think you're going beyond the basics, if you have an interest in going beyond the basics, tread carefully and also figure out what your context is as much as fucking possible. And you won't necessarily, like, developing your context more fully, I do think will pull you beyond step 1. But I think it's important as much as possible to be thinking about context, because it informs so much. And I think that's a wrap. I know it's super late, but anyone who wants to, we'll be in the after party here real shortly. I gotta plug my phone in, but we'll be there real shortly. It's been fun hanging out, and we'll see y'all next month.
See you then.
Bye.